It's July and it's time to talk college football. I've spent a lot of time talking the NFL, the draft, the schedule, the upcoming season. We're kind of in limbo, not much going on in the NFL, but once the fireworks hit on July 4th, it's a signal that college football is around the corner. And I'm really pleased to have a special guest, Tyler Shoemaker, here. We have not connected in the past, but he's produced some very special work that's available to everybody over on Twitter. We'll talk about some of his work as we go along. But Tyler, thanks for coming on to talk college football. How are you today?
Ryan, great to be here. Big fan of your work, and I'm excited to be here. I can't wait to talk some college football.
Well, that's what we're going to do. There's so much to unpack because the landscape changes just crazily. But before we get in, just a bit of an introduction. How did you get involved in college football and the handicapping side, and really in the content side? What's been your evolution to get to where you are now?
Yeah, great question. So my college football fandom, I guess, started really. I mean, when I was a kid, I'm from close to Huntington, West Virginia, and my dad had season Marshall tickets my whole life, so I was exposed to some lower level college football as a child, and then I went to Ohio State for college. So then it kind of really ramped up there, being a Buckeye, and so that's kind of where my college football fandom came in, and my interest in it. And then in 2017, I started to kind of get interested in recreationally sports betting, and I'm just a naturally competitive person. So I was like, okay, if I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna know how to do it, know what I'm doing, and be able to feel comfortable with the bets that I'm making. So I started to kind of do some back of the napkin math at the time. Then that turned into a spreadsheet, and then over the last 6 years, it's just evolved and into the complex being that it is today, that I put out on Twitter for free for everyone to absorb and use to make them more informed fans and bettors.
Yeah, that's great. And I hate to date myself, but I've been doing this for far longer than you have. But things change. I mean, honestly, year to year, we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go on. And I treat college and the NFL differently. I look at stats, some stats like line of scrimmage stats, quarterback accuracy, returning offensive line starters in the college. That stuff doesn't mean as much to me in the NFL. What stats are important to you as you go through and prepare for a college season?
Yeah, that's great. And it's funny because you could ask 100 different people that do what we do, and I think you'd probably get 100 different answers because there's so many stats and there's so much information available. And that's kind of been the evolution of my process, is kind of trial and error in which stats are predictive. And I think you could make a model using any variety of stats. I personally like to use points per play, for and allowed, as well as points per drive, more efficiency-based metrics to help forecast how many points a team would be expected to score and allow against the average FBS team.
Okay. Because I was thinking, and I'll be thinking all the time through your responses, is that, okay, so how do you, and I ask this question of a lot of people, how do you account for fourth quarter scoring? If the game's 30-10, for example, and there's 5 minutes left and they let the team go down the field, because it's just a meaningless touchdown.
Yeah, that's one of the harder pieces of college in particular, because there are so many more blowouts than in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I dove into quite a bit last summer. And what I found was, although garbage time isn't necessarily predictable per se in terms of how it's going to go, I have found that it does generally benefit the favorite. So I looked at it, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it was favorites of 30 or more. Generally, if there's garbage time points scored, it's generally in favor of that team. So I don't necessarily change my power rating or anything like that, my projection on a game based on that, but it would make me more likely to take the favorite. If my number says, okay, take this team minus 32, I'm like, okay, there's probably going to be garbage time as well. My number says minus 35, and then I'm even more likely to take that, to make that bet, because of the garbage time advantage that I would perceive that team to have.
Okay. And I would be probably a little bit aligned with you there. I would look at line of scrimmage data, and if I have a team like you, they're favored by 30, and I say, well, they're going to win by 32 or 35. If they're going to dominate the line of scrimmage, even if they're not trying to run out the score, they're probably going to run up the score. And then if both teams substitute and both teams use second string, then the favorite second string is going to be better. It's already probably on par if you're a 30-point favorite, or better than the other team's first string. They're clearly going to be better than the other team's second string.
Yep. Yeah. No, that's exactly my thought process as well. I'm right there with you, that if it does get to garbage time, you're talking the backups, and definitely the favorite is going to have better backups. So that just lends itself to more of an advantage, both in terms of the spread and the total potentially going over as well.
So it took me way back when, about 2 years, to really hone in on a system to generate power numbers. And ever since then, I've done it very mechanically, adjusting, of course, for injuries. You had to adjust during COVID and all that other thing. But in general, I've been very comfortable for well over 30 years in using a power number system. With power numbers or generating ratings, there's still more challenges now because of roster turnover in the college is at an all-time high. First of all, how do you generate opening power numbers, and how do you account for all this variance?
Yeah, the preseason numbers definitely are the hardest to formulate for sure, that's something that I took a lot of time this spring to really think about, because I wasn't thrilled with how my 2022 season started out. It ended up going very well, but the first few weeks, when you're relying more on those preseason numbers, they just weren't what I wanted them to be. So I spent a lot of time really looking at that and formulating. And the biggest thing that I have incorporated this year in my numbers that I haven't previously is kind of a developmental rating, because most preseason numbers are going to rely heavily on recruiting rankings, obviously, because the talent is the baseline of how far a team can go. However, I did think long and hard, because you have to reward teams like a Michigan, for example, and they're really the team that made me think about this, because they recruit well, but not truly elite like a Georgia or Alabama or Ohio State in most cases. So I really looked at that and came up with a formula to kind of reward teams like that, and conversely penalize teams like Texas A&M, for instance, who recruits extremely well, and it doesn't quite translate to performance on the field. So I have come up with a formula this year that I'm very excited to test out, and I think it's going to go well.
Okay. So some of the other factors that go into power ratings, you can tell me yes or no, I care about this, or I don't care about this. Do you care about how a team ended the season, let's say last 3-4 games, bowl games and stuff like that? Because sometimes power numbers can be artificially inflated or deflated at the end of the year.
I care. I won't say I specifically account for that, those last few games in particular. So I do look at it, that once I come up with my preseason number for 2023, for instance, I will look back at the end of 2022 and kind of see where there may be some major discrepancies. And that's where I kind of start to dig in a little deeper and see what's going on. Like a Florida State, for instance, they finished the season last year as well as anybody. I've got them 12th this year. So, high, but not as high as some, I think. So I think some people have Florida State, well within the top 10 for sure.
Yeah, no, I understand that too. You're probably not as high as your highest point right there when everything was flowing. But then if you have roster continuity, if you have coaching continuity, I actually have at my fingertips, for example, the last 4 to 5 years of opening and closing power ratings for each team. And then if there's been 3 new coaches, 5 new quarterbacks and stuff like that, it's not going to be that helpful to me. But if you have a very stable program like Iowa, for example, system's the same, take it or leave it with the offense, but the coaching is the same.
Yep.
The defense is the same, which is unbelievable. Their turnover rate is the same. I can use that numbers, and I can probably wake up, turn over in my bed and give them a power rating as opposed to another team.
Yeah.
I don't know your feelings there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I do factor that in. That is part of my process, is to evaluate, not only the team, but the program and the coach. You know, you look at like USC, for instance. It's hard to just look at what USC's done over the last few years because, you know, they're now in year 2 of Lincoln Riley. That's not going to be the same as it
Yeah.
was in the previous regime under Helton. So for USC's rating, for instance, I looked at what Lincoln Riley did at Oklahoma and factored that into how I rated USC for the season. And to your point with the quarterback, you know, you have a quarterback like Caleb Williams who wasn't recruited by USC; he was at Oklahoma. That also is another adjustment to consider as well.
Yeah. So transitioning from there, um, roster turnover, absolutely incredible. USC is an example. They overhauled their entire offensive roster, it seemed, last year. And this year, they're trying to make inroads defensively because that didn't work out as well. You can't fix everything in a day, and team depth, you know, is not going to be as good because you're taking some players and you're moving them off the roster. So if you're evaluating that, I mean, it's a tough thing because when I look at returning starters, which used to be important in the NFL, I have an issue with some of the data out there, Phil Steele's data and some of the other data. I generate my own returning starter data based on the nil transfers and so on and so forth. I don't take what I see in books at face value. How do you deal with the fact that you might see 3 or 4 different offensive linemen, but they have previous, it's not just new guys, freshmen or sophomores stepping up, but you know, they may have 3 new starters who already have 50, 60 starts at the collegiate level.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And to be honest with you, in my model, I don't necessarily account for, like, I don't necessarily map out, okay, these are the projected starters because one, just from the standpoint of time, I don't have the time to do that. So I had to try to make it easier on myself, a little bit more efficient. So I do, thankfully, 247 Sports has a great tool on their recruiting pages where you can kind of add and take people out of classes, and that's kind of how I handle roster turnover and the transfer portal, is by basically simulating those classes based on what those teams are going to look like this year, and then I weight those. I give each team a 4-year weighted average, you know, weighing less for freshmen, for instance, and that sort of thing. And that's kind of how I account for that.
Yeah. And now we have 7-year players with super seniors and stuff like that. I think there was somebody who was denied an 8th year and, you know, he had to finally leave college. You know, I think I saw comedy movies like that, but
yeah, I was going to say that's Tommy Boy.
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting because age used to be a BYU thing, for example. You know, their linemen, when they're further developed chronologically in terms of age and stuff like that, I always felt like they had an advantage over certain teams because these guys were off missions. And so they come back 23, 24 years old, and they're playing against guys whose bodies haven't grown yet, 18-year-olds. Yep. So now you have super seniors everywhere. It negates their advantage. And now they're, you know, here's a transitional question. Now they're going into a league where they're playing conference games. How do you go about assessing that? Do you assess that in your model, the fact that a team is going from independent to now one of a Power 5 conference league?
Yeah, that was tricky. But the one thing about my model that I do take a lot of pride in, that I think is kind of really the heart of my numbers, is the opponent adjustment aspect. You know, obviously we're talking in season numbers now, but being able to look back, and that's why one of my big projects this offseason was to do historic ratings where I went back to the year 2000. I'm going to go back farther, but so far I'm back to the year 2000, and be able to run my formula through all of that, look how a team has performed historically, and really apply those opponent adjustments each year. And that I think that's worked out pretty well. I mean, the way those ratings turned out, I think just seems right, you know, with the eye test.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a formula, or do you pay attention to a deeper dive besides new coaches, head coaches, going into either positional coaches like offensive line or coordinators when you see a scheme change or a shift change? Do you pay attention to coaching changes?
I do pay attention. I will say I very rarely adjust the number based on that. Like for instance, like Brian Hartline is taking over as offensive coordinator at Ohio State. He's never called plays before. That is something that I am aware of and kind of on alert for, that, hey, maybe I'm going to have to adjust Ohio State's offensive numbers maybe quicker than I normally would if, if it looks like a disaster, or if they light it up even, more so than the offense typically does. So I am aware and on alert for those things. I don't necessarily factor it into the number, just because I think those things are pretty hard to quantify.
Okay. So this is the first time we're together, so you get my automatic question on special teams, because I honestly do not think handicappers, everybody, pays enough attention to special teams, especially in the college ranks where there's more missed kicks and field position and punt returns are still allowed in college as opposed to the NFL, the way that the game is going, and kick returns. Talk to me about what's your overall feeling about how you incorporate special teams play into your models?
Yeah, it's one of those things. There are some really good numbers. There's a lot of people that track that stuff really closely. I am not one of them. I'll give a shout out to Parker Fleming, Stats of War on Twitter. He does a great job with some graphs and special teams. So I always reference kind of what he's pointing out. I will say, though, full transparency, I don't incorporate a special teams rating into my model, just because I certainly don't undervalue it in terms of the impact it can have on a game. I just find it hard to be predictive with how special teams are going to impact any given game, just because I feel like there is some luck and a lot of statistical variance there, like a kick return touchdown or something like that. Unless it's one of these elite returners that does it on a regular basis, that you can kind of start to factor that in. A lot of times, to me, it seems more fluky than predictive.
Yeah, it's a tightrope line that you have to go. In the NFL, when you think everybody's at an even playing level in terms of they were all somewhat collegiate stars, I'm basically looking at year by year results, consistency and coordinator, and just kind of throwing out the middle of the pack. I don't care if you finished 9th or 20th. I don't care. I care who were the top 5 and who were the bottom 5 and who are consistently in the top 5 and bottom 5, and it matters. But in college, it's funny how many teams do not even have special team coordinators. Nebraska, that one year about 2 or 3 years ago, when they lost all those one-score games, most of them had to deal with special teams, and they did not have a coordinator. Yep, and I'm thinking, right. You're Nebraska. You've had Bob Devaney from way back, and you had Frank Solich. I mean, you've had all these great coaches, Tom Osborne, and you don't have a coordinator for, what some people would say is a third of your unit. So that bothers me when a team doesn't have a coordinator. But I'll continue to fight the fight for special teams.
Yeah, no, I will be on the lookout for anything you put out, special teams related, because any special teams data is in addition to what I'm doing, for sure. It's funny you say that, though, because again, me being around the Ohio State, Twitter sphere, there have actually been people complaining that Ohio State does have a special teams coordinator and that they're not using that coaching position more on the defensive side of the ball. So it's funny. There's I guess a lot of voices on both sides of it.
There's so many coaches already, and actually, if you go back to almost every Ohio State Penn State game, Penn State has had a chance to win, especially at home. I don't know, 3 or 4 of the last 5 times. And there's usually a kick return, a block punt. Something happens on special teams. I think you ought to automatically award 3 points for Ohio State when they play Penn State on special teams. But that's an aside and a fluke. But if I'm Penn State, I would do something differently when you line up in punt formation against a team like that.
Certainly.
That's my own thing. Well, let's switch gears now and talk more about 2023 in general. Since you've already made and just unbelievable in terms of your spreadsheets and how you can point and click on a team, on a conference, and so on and so forth. I love the ease of how you can just maneuver around what you do. So really a shout out, and people who are watching or listening to this should really check your work out because it's very easy to navigate. Walk me through maybe one or two examples of a team you might be higher on and a team you might be lower on for this upcoming season.
Yeah, I think in terms of being higher on a team, I think Wisconsin comes to mind. I've got them 17th. I think most of the other models, other people that I've seen put out ratings have them somewhere in the 20s, if not the 30s. And I think the reason for that is this is one example where I did really factor in the coaching change, and I do think Luke Fickell is going to be a major upgrade over Paul Chryst. So again, I did go back and look at kind of several years of data of what Luke Fickell did at Cincinnati and how his teams performed from a power rating standpoint relative to their talent, and kind of mix that in with what we've seen out of Wisconsin, over the last handful of years, and kind of what their ceiling as a program is, and kind of found myself somewhere in the middle of that. Yeah. And then in terms of being lower on a team, I think Washington definitely fits that bill. I've got them 16th, which I don't think is too terribly low, but I know there's a lot of people that have them in the top 10 and are really pushing them for playoff contention this year. And again, I'm not going to be shocked if Washington, ends up coming out of the Pac-12 and making the playoff. I just think nothing in their metrics that I found, and the fact that they're in year 2 of a new coach, there's just a lot of unknowns there that I wasn't comfortable going any higher on Washington at this point.
I live in Pac-12 country and born and raised in Pac-12 country. And I know they shoot themselves in the foot often by how competitive. And I think that's going to happen again this year before we go to the expanded playoff. Because if you look at the top 5 or 6 teams, I mean, Utah, it's really about their coach and their consistency and their training and their teaching. USC, tremendous roster, still has to make defensive strides. Washington and Oregon have top 5 potential quarterbacks in terms of what's going in terms of both second year of their systems, and I think Washington might be underrated in terms of their pass rush. There's a couple guys coming off now a year removed from major injury and stuff, but these teams could end up beating each other, and then you get a team like Oregon State who can end up upsetting one or two of them and throwing everybody for a loop. So in the end, they're probably not going to make the playoffs again, but I think at the top of that conference can compete, to what you said. And that's why a Washington team may not end up in the top 15 or 16, because it's competitive every week at the top.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and just for context, I've got them at 16. I've got Oregon at 10. So 6 spots different, but that's only the difference of 3.1 points in terms of a power rating. So, I mean, they're a field goal difference from being in the top 10.
Yeah, and I have a guess when I hone in on my power ratings, there'll be about a 2-point difference between the two overall, and a lot of similar numbers at the top of the Pac-12. And then you get to a team like Colorado. How do you assess a team that essentially has kicked everybody off their roster? I think we're all going to learn. It's a test case for everything, because I have no idea what they're going to do, other than the fact that possibly they're going to go 0-12.
Yeah, I definitely. I have not yet, but I am pretty sure I'm going to be betting their season win total under, even though it's at 3.5, I believe. I've got them power rated 99th in the country, and honestly, honestly, that was me giving every possible quantifiable benefit of the doubt that I could find in any data relative to just the program ceiling over the last handful of years. Kind of I looked back at what Dion did at Jackson State, and again, every benefit of the doubt that I could possibly justify with numbers, and I've still got them 99th. So I don't have high hopes for them this year, but like you said, they will be an excellent test case for, can you really just completely overhaul an entire roster in an offseason and make it happen? So we'll see.
Yeah, it's a fascinating study. I looked at a couple of the teams based on what I saw with your numbers, and UAB, I think you're right around their win total, maybe slightly above their win total. I have some concerns because Bill Clark was such an unbelievable coach for that team. I mean, he took them from the dead. They were giving up football, and he brought them into consistency. Then, unfortunately, he had to have that serious back issue. Last year, they floundered around. Their win total was way too high last year. And now they bring in Trent Dilfer, who I think was coaching high school or something like
Yep,
that.
I believe so.
How did you arrive at, basically almost having no opinion, kind of going with the prevailing numbers?
Yeah, this is a perfect example of I don't know what Trent Dilfer is going to be as a coach, so I can't make an adjustment one way or the other. So I kind of just had to let the cards fall where they may, based on the numbers, and be willing to be wrong on this. I do have them. Their win total is at 5.5. The last time I checked, I've got them projected at 6.7 wins. I've got
Okay.
them with this. I've got them with the 68th toughest strength of schedule. So right there in the middle of the pack in terms of their strength of schedule. So I'm certainly willing to be wrong on them, but that was not a team I have strong conviction on with their
Yeah.
rating for sure.
Some of them are going to be high variance for sure.
Yep, absolutely.
So one of my pet peeves, not necessarily a pet peeve, but it's an area of excitement for me, is when a team is projected to be out of its weight class. Iowa State a couple of years ago, all of a sudden they were in a lot of people's top 10 coming off the COVID year and stuff like that. North Carolina State last year, I thought they were out of their weight class. This is a very good program, thrives more as an underdog, and you get I think they were just a level too high. I don't know if you have any of those teams this year, but I'm going to give you a different type of example. UConn surprised everybody last year. They got to 6 wins with Jim Mora Jr., a proven coach. He's done some good things. And now you've regressed them a little bit. Your numbers on them, I think, are lower than prevailing market, which I don't disagree with. But what was your thinking on that?
Yeah, I'm looking here to see. Yeah, so I've got them at 3.7 wins on the season. Their current win total is 4.5. The tricky thing here though is that their strength of schedule is miserable. It's 121st in the country.
Yeah.
So again, if I'm wrong on, not that there's much value here. This isn't enough value for me to make a bet on this anyway. But certainly, if they went over with that strength of schedule and kind of how they surprised people last year, I can't say I'd be entirely surprised. And Coach Moore did do a good job last year. But again, it's hard with these preseason numbers where they had, one good season or half of a good season compared to just how bad they've been historically. It's very difficult they haven't really earned that benefit of the doubt yet.
Yeah, and that's something I don't think can be understated. I think you get value. People like us can get value in that when they're just stepping up to a weight class that you don't think they deserve to be in. They haven't proven they're there. I agree completely. So in transitioning a little bit to week 1, for example, because you've got your numbers out for week 1. Actually, before we go to week 1, I do want to make one other point. I look at the schedules, and not all schedules in September are created equal. Think back to last year when UCLA basically played Manny, Mo, and Jack before they entered the season. And there are some teams, some of them are SEC teams, some of them Baylor typically schedules a pretty weak early schedule and so on and so forth. I'm looking for teams that might be 3-0 after the first 3 games, but they didn't play anybody and they didn't dominate anybody, and looking to fade some of those teams. Are there any things that you look at or make a point of emphasis where you say, watch for this? Where are they after week 3 or 4?
That's a good point. It's not necessarily something I've considered. However, again, I think my hope is that my preseason work is solid enough, and that my me being quick to adapt my in-season numbers, with that opponent adjustment, is accurate enough that it should be encapsulated in, as we're going into week 4, week 5.
Yeah.
That should be accurately reflected in my number. Is kind of my hope and how I've built my formula out. So that is an excellent point and something I will be cognizant of as we go into this season.
Yeah, typically I wait 4 weeks before I throw out a lot of my information, although I have a team sheet for everybody. So I know where I expect them to be at week 4. And if they're higher, I note it. If they're lower, I note it. If they're the same, then steady as she goes and that kind of thing. So I'm not using my rushing formula data until 4 weeks of data has come in. But like you hinted at, like what you said, there are a couple of teams, certainly the Arizona State, who had roster turnover, Colorado, others. I'm going to have to be with this nil error and this transfer error, be willing to transfer data and set aside prior convictions a little bit earlier, maybe for 10 or 15% of the teams. And I've usually not done that for more than 3 or 4 teams in the past. And now I might be talking about 20 teams.
Yep.
Yeah, it is really crazy. What stands out to you week 1 so far in terms of your numbers and, just early thinking?
Yeah, what really has jumped out, because when I put my sheet together of the week 0 and week 1 games, I put in my line, put in what the Vegas line is, and then the difference in that is what I consider value, and then I sort it by the value, and I'm noticing here at the top, a lot of the higher value games are these huge spreads. Like for instance, Auburn UMass,
Yeah.
the line 39.5, I projected 27.5. Michigan ECU, the line's 36.5. I project 26. So I'm gonna approach those cautiously. I'm probably not gonna bet any big spreads. I'm not a huge trends guy, but I did see a trend that I think is hard to ignore that someone had tweeted out the other day, that over the last few seasons, 2 or 3 seasons, week 0 and week 1 favorites of 30 or more are covering the closing line at like 63%. So that's kind of tough to ignore, especially when I'm seeing this much perceived value. So I'm probably going to stay away from these huge spreads for week 0 and 1. So then in terms of looking at what I might actually play, I'm thinking one that I like is Notre Dame minus 20 versus Navy. I would play that up to 21. For a number of reasons, but I mean, at the baseline of that reason, I've got Notre Dame ranked 10th in their weighted talent ranking, and Navy is 129th. So just the talent discrepancy alone, I know that Navy generally doesn't get blown out a whole lot, except these early season games. I remember a couple of years ago they got killed by Marshall, shut out, I believe, by Marshall early in the season. So Navy has been a very slowly developing team throughout the course of the season over the last handful. So I will lay up to 21 with Notre Dame against them in week 1.
It's an interesting game because if Navy does transition, they have a new coach now.
Mm-hmm.
They're talking about passing more. So is Army. Army's talking about passing more. And we saw it with Georgia Tech a few years ago, right before all the changes in terms of what you're allowed to have transfers in. It might be easier to change systems if you go out and automatically poach people from other programs.
Yeah.
But Navy and Air Force and Army, Stanford, some of these other teams, they can't really poach others. They don't have that same transfer thing in effect. And I think Navy is in trouble game 1, just like you said, because of that.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So that's kind of where I'd go. The other thing is you put out in that spreadsheet, if people want to look at your week 1 forecasts. And I agree with you what you said. The first thing I saw when I looked at your forecast was, wow, your favorites aren't favored by enough according to the spread versus your numbers and whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe go back and pretend that UMass is a high school team or something like that, because yeah. But you never know how it comes up, because there's a diamond out of the rough. Like UConn last year would have been a high spread, and then here they came and they served notice. Took probably 3 games for others to catch on. But in addition to your spreads, you also put out totals. And even though I've been doing this for a long time, I have not spent a large majority of time on totals. I won't make many totals plays until it comes to the bowl season, for example. So walk me through how you chart totals, or what goes into how you assess where a total should be set compared to where they are set.
Yeah, so in terms of early season, particularly week 1 totals, I pretty much won't bet them. again, even though I know how much work I put into it, I still there's just, in terms of total, it's just much harder to project, I think. But one of the things, like I was mentioning earlier, in the evolution of my process and of my model, I really, one, I wanted to be different than like SP Plus, for instance, that most people are familiar with that, the at ESPN. He doesn't he will tweet out his totals, but in terms of putting out his weekly numbers, it's just a power rating. There's no way to calculate a total off of that. So that was
Mhm.
something that I took some pride in, like, okay, I want people to be able to formulate totals on their own using my numbers. So my power rating and my total projections are intertwined in that you'll notice in the sheet I have a points added column, which is my metric of what a team would contribute to a total, so that you can easily look at, okay, Ohio State's points added is X. I think it's 32.2, and Georgia's is 27.8. So you can easily look at those and say, okay, if Ohio State and Georgia played each other on a neutral, it would be a 60-point total. And just easy math. And then my power rating is actually a product of that as well, because it's their offensive rating minus the defensive rating equals the power, and the offense and defensive ratings averaged out is what the points added would be
Mhm.
to the total. So that's kind of how I get there. And again, that I feel like that makes it easy for the user, for the recreational bettor that's looking at my sheet, to be able to easily, come up with hypothetical matchups, or if they want to look down the road and say this team plays this team in week 6, what can I expect that total to maybe look like?
Was that the process you used last year? And if so, how did it work out? How did you feel about how the totals evolved over the course of the season?
So it the formula that I used to begin last year was not the same formula that it is now. It evolved over the season as I started to, because I'm constantly, self critiquing and trying to come up with new ways, and I'm always back testing different formula ideas. And the formula that I have now is what I implemented roughly halfway through last season, and I was really happy with how the totals went overall. I don't have the data in front of me, but the people that followed me throughout the season can attest that the totals were pretty good last year.
Right. I mean, it's just an area. I think you mentioned how many hours are there in the day, time management. It's just an area that if I delved into it now, there would be some trial and error, and I'm just
Yep,
sticking with what I know and
absolutely.
relying on others if I want to go that way. One more basic question I have, because it fascinated me that you tweeted out that you had normalized 2020 data, which is a very abnormal
Yeah,
year in the history of college football. You probably have to go back to World War II or something like that to see,
yep.
you know, what else was going on there. And it's fascinating to me because there were a few nuggets that I was able to use based on home and road splits and other things. But you had one conference, Pac 12, basically playing 4 games or 5 games. You had some
Yep.
conferences where Virginia Tech, for example, they must have had 2 or 3 weeks in a row where they had at least 20 people out due to COVID. And you wouldn't even know that until 30 minutes before game time, because for medical reasons, they weren't obligated to do that. University of
Right.
California, the California Arizona game was a crazy one, and a University of Pittsburgh game where there were deletions from the starting roster 15 minutes before game. So how did you normalize that data? What did you do with all this unequal data?
Yeah, I will say that the caveat to provide additional context to my tweet, I did say I normalized it as much as 2020 data can be normalized. So I don't want people to think I like magically made it the same as other years, because I don't think that's the case, for the reasons you outlined, particularly with people, just teams missing so many guys. There was really just no way for me to account for that. But the hard thing was, because there was little to no interconference play, those data points are extremely important for any model. But again, especially when you're talking about trying to adjust for opponent, if we don't have any of those interconference data points, I mean, my numbers came out looking crazy, to the point that I couldn't even use 2020 numbers in coming up with my 2023 projections.
Yeah.
You know, I couldn't factor those in at all. However, I did sit and think about it, and again, the part of me doing all my historic ratings was to help provide context around things. And one of the things that I took out of that was I was able to look in the college football playoff era. I was able to assign each conference kind of its own rating, an average rating for each conference, and then adjust the 2020 data from there so that I didn't have Miami of Ohio, for instance, in the top 5 like they initially were, or Buffalo, because they didn't play any. They played 3 games and they were all against MAC teams. So
That's right.
being able to somewhat normalize and simulate what the interconference play might have looked like was extremely helpful in coming up with like, okay, this now I've got 2020 Alabama with a 34 power rating, which makes a whole lot more sense based on what we actually saw from them on the field. So, and it got a lot of those MAC schools out of the top 10, thankfully.
Yeah, it's just such tricky information to have to deal with. And,
Yep.
When I go year to year, how do you assign the power numbers and so on? And then, the funny thing, not funny, I think the sad thing for me is that all these teams basically were learning on the fly. Coaches had to be more than just coaches. And yet we still had something like 23 to 25 coaches either fired or changed jobs or something like that. It wasn't really any different than any other year. I thought the ADs would cut some slack for some of these coaches, and they really didn't. And I just found that troubling more than anything, because we know college football is a business now. It's what you've done lately. A lot of these coaches like Shane Beamer of Virginia Tech and some of these others would have never lasted as long as they did if we applied the same win now pressure that we do in college football. But I guess we're all on the hot seat now.
That's right.
Whatever we do. So today is July 7th, 7/7. What's on your agenda? Because everything is out there. You basically played out the season in a way in terms of your power ratings, but we know things could change between now and kickoff, week 0 and week 1.
Sure.
What are some of the things you'll be doing in college football between now and the first kickoff?
Yeah, I'll continue. There will be another transfer portal window open, so I will monitor that. I don't anticipate that having a major impact on this season, because it would just be hard to come in the fall and play and make an impact. So I don't anticipate any major shakeups in my numbers, but certainly if there are any changes, I will get those out and update my sheet accordingly. The link to my sheet is on my Twitter, of course. Honestly, I feel good about where my college football work is now. I'm just going to continue to work on my historic ratings and do historic ratings for other sports. I just did my NFL historic ratings back to 2000 as well. I'm going to do men's and women's college basketball, NBA and WNBA as well.
Oh my goodness. I try to stick to one sport, and all these youngsters in the field are, as soon as you get into pickleball, I'm going to start worrying about the younger group.
Yeah.
So
I'll worry about me. I'll worry about me as well.
Tyler, it's absolutely been a pleasure to talk NCAA football with you. You really know your stuff, and I know you're just going to get bigger and bigger out there. Tell everybody where you can be found and what's next for you, and promote yourself.
Yeah, the best place to follow me is on Twitter at TShoeIndex. That's the name of my motto. I got sick of saying, "Oh, my numbers say," or "My model says," so I named it TShoeIndex. That's my Twitter handle. I'm also now on Threads, as that's becoming more popular. Same handle. Coming up, you can find me on the College Football Playbook channel, both the podcast on all podcast platforms, as well as the YouTube channel where we do some video stuff. That's our national college football show. I hope to be back on betting the Buckeyes on Buckeye Talk this fall for season 2. And I've got some other things in the works that I can't quite announce yet, but follow me on Twitter and then come along for the ride on those as well.
Okay. Well, that sounds great. And hopefully sometime during the season, adjustment time or whatever, maybe we'll hook up again. Tyler, again, thanks for sharing the stage, and really kicking off the NCAA content part. I do not know when I'll be back with another podcast. I'm hopefully going to line up some other people and then resume some of the stuff that we did last year in between a trip to Iceland, but that's another story. So thanks for everybody for listening and watching. Subscribe and tell other people about it, and we'll talk to you later on.